Let's just talk about that for a second here and lead into another thing that I think is very interesting, is that they were asked for a traffic impact fee that was equal to the amount they were paying for the property. Somehow that just doesn't equate in my book. The other thing is, if we have traffic impact fees for a private company like that, and they're talking about a biomass plant downtown, but trucks would travel on the roads, but there'd be no impact fee on those inside the city limits. Somehow I'm looking for consistency in government, and I don't see it there.
Okay. And what is your view on impact fees?
Impact fees, what happens is you start increasing those, and what government traditionally does is look for increase in revenue streams. And one of the things is that they found that they could charge impact fees because they in fact are costing government more. And I understand that portion of it. But as you increase impact fees, what happens is that you actually cut out a lower level of potential buyers, because the builder has to add impact fees onto his costs. And then that cost is passed on to the buyer, and the buyers, then it cuts out some of the lower income or not as high income people. So it drastically reduces the number of people who are eligible to buy a new home. Well, let me put it to you this way. I love baseball. As a matter of fact, I'm still playing softball and competitively in the Vancouver Senior League. We have 8 teams there, and we play 4 times a week. There are 8 teams, so you get to play a doubleheader once a week. So I really love the sport. The problem is, though, that the vast majority of Vancouver citizens, and all the polling I've been able to do, all the contact I made, they love baseball, but they don't want one more penny of tax. At the recent forum that we just had last night or the night before, Betty Sue Morris stepped up, and she was on the panel and gave a very eloquent speech about better uses of taxes. If we're going to raise taxes, there are probably better uses for that. I thought that was her synopsis of that, and her summary was right dead on. So I say no to the tax, yes to the baseball. How they're going to do it, we don't know. But let's say that we have some wealthy people in the neighborhood, which we do. If this is such a good investment, then why don't we have the private sector coming forth and putting forth a good portion of that stadium? So if we need baseball here, then I think the private sector should step up to the plate and help bring it in. I was speaking with several department heads in the city recently, and Brian Carlson from Public Works and I had a discussion, and the idea of REIT came up. REIT that right now is supposed to, the real estate excise tax is supposed to be used for capital improvements and capital projects. But if somehow we could get the law changed that we could use a portion of the REIT money to fund basic core services, fire and police, for instance, that would certainly help alleviate the problem of the budget shortfall. The other thing is that we'll probably get into this later on about the economics of it. As you're looking at the budget, we have a certain amount of revenue coming in. We have more places to spend the money than we have. So if you keep cutting and cutting, and you can't cut any further on your budget, then it means that you have to have more revenue. And how do you do that? You don't want to tax people, because so many people are close to the margin right now of not having any disposable income. So economic growth is a real key to increasing revenues so that we can exceed our budget requirements. Let me put it to you this way. They have not made a decision yet. This is still out for public opinion. And I've been sitting on several of their meetings, and some of the renditions of the buses are just absolutely beautiful. And I think the buses themselves really look nice on there. If we go to the center aisle for loading and unloading passengers, or curbside, that's still up for question. I don't think that I have enough information yet nor do the members of the committee that I've talked to as to make a final decision on how that should happen. But it is a big problem there. One of the things that we're talking about is if you put the island in the center and do the center loading there, is that what happens is then that if you want to turn left, and let's say you're driving down northeast bound out on 4th Plain there, and you see a pizza place over there, and you say, I'm going to stop and get a pizza. You can't turn there. And so that's a loss of business for that pizza parlor, see? So the idea is here that we have to find some kind of a solution, and I'll tell you, there's a lot of really well-intended people who are working on this problem, and I have faith that, that the citizens are going to make enough inputs that we can finally come to a good decision. I don't know what that is yet, but I'm willing to sit on the committee and come up with some good answers. Well, I was not aware that that's all of the gas mileage increase that they got. So if you look at the economics of that, it sounds more like it's for public goodwill and to satisfy a certain segment of our population rather than actually showing a true savings. And I'd like to see those numbers again. And I'm a big number man. In the private sector, I had a lot to do with financing. Capital raising, etc. So I can look at those spreadsheets and get a pretty good idea where we're going on that, and I have not seen those yet. But I think that this recent increase that they had in it, in the fare, I read about that in the paper, I was not aware of it until then. I'm not for spending a lot of money to get marginal increases in performance. I want to protect the taxpayers' dollars and hold down the cost of transportation for our lower income people. I've been a strong advocate for years against this project. Number one is we don't have the population to support it here. We don't have the population density. I've ridden rail in Tokyo where they have to actually push people on board. They have pushers, which is kind of an interesting thing. And I've been in London, Barcelona, Paris, London, etc. And there they have population densities that you just can't put people, in New York also, and you could not put that amount of people in travel and have any economy going if you put them on the surface, so they had to go underground. Chicago, remember, they went elevated. But then as you get out in the country, then it's back to ground transportation again. I went from Chicago O'Hare Airport downtown into the Loop for $5.25 round trip. It would have cost $40 each way by taxi cab. So in order to make their population mobile and get to and from work, they have to have that. We don't have to have it here. And a price tag of $850 million for 2.9 miles of track, when right now we've only got 1,650 people who travel round trip to commute, doesn't make economic sense to me. And so I think that we could do that with the buses that they have. I previously talked about on 4th Plain, the rendition that I saw, makes more sense to me because we can take that load and do it by bus.
Okay.
I just think it's too much money. The other thing is that we have to remember they're talking about building for the future and that light rail is the future. U.S. Navy carriers right now are using something different than steam on their catapults, which they've done that for 50 years. They're using magnetism. Now you tell me that you can throw an 80,000-pound airplane in 200 feet and it's going 200 miles an hour, if that's not energy. So how do we know that we can't use magnetism to power our vehicles in, say, 20 years? But in 30 years, we have to refurbish the tracks, and that goes anywhere from 50 to 100% of your initial capital cost. Are we going to set aside money so that when we get there, we're going to be able to do that without additional taxations? There's some real problems with light rail here, and mostly of it is, I think, is in the economics of it. don't believe in an undesirable sprawl because I am a free market solution person, and I am a capitalist, and I'm proudly so. So I'm not nearly as worried that. Certainly you have to have zoning restrictions, and I've addressed that several times, that we do have to have zoning restrictions, and that's to protect the property owners who are already there. If you look at the home builders here locally, where do they have the Street of Dreams? You've never seen it downtown, have you? But yet you see it in the outskirts, and that's where people with money want to build, the majority of them anyway. There's a lot of people who like downtown living, just like in New York. You find people who like living in Manhattan. I wouldn't like living in Manhattan because I was born and raised here in the Portland area, and I'm used to free open spaces. We own a single family dwelling, and that is my style of living, and I should not be restricted from that because of the way that our country was raised, is that people have the freedom of choice, and you let your dollars do the walking. We should make affordable housing available for those who need it, and maybe we have to have some cluster there, but I don't think that the government has always made good choices in picking winners and losers. Therefore, I think that we should let the free market prevail. Well, I've been advocating this. I ran for city council in 2009, and one of the things I was talking about was that before we rebuild the Columbia River crossing as it's presently envisioned, that we should build bridges to the west and the east. How far east? I don't know, 164th, 192nd, anywhere that you pick along there will relieve congestion on the I-5 corridor. With the project that we're looking at right now, all it does is flood the corridor even more without relief to the east or west. Now that, I think, is, as a matter of fact, John Charles, the president of Cascade Policy Institute over in Portland, has advocated for that too. And I think that makes sense to me, is get traffic off of I-5 so that we can actually make traffic move. CRC changed or did not include the Rose Quarter or 405 going across the Fremont Bridge in the bridge impact area. That should have been, because that is a real key when we're going south in the morning, a lot of people going to work over in Oregon. That is a real blocker coming through there. And going through Delta Park is stop and go too, on the northbound in the evening. And once you clear the bridge, it's clear sailing usually, going north on I-5. 205 gets clobbered because we go from 3 lanes down to 2 north of State 500. So there are congestion periods here, but the building of this bridge as it's presently envisioned will not reduce congestion, period. Dr. Steve Citron is an expert in this field, and he's testified many times on this subject, and I like his explanation. Well, I have studied the debt structure, and I talked about this in 2009. For the 12 years prior to 2009, the 12-year period ending in June 30th of 2009, the city had accumulated $48 million worth of additional debt, and that's a 12-year period. That means $4 million a year in debt that the city had acquired, even though they're supposed to have a balanced budget. I find it difficult to believe that the city can acquire debt and say they have a balanced budget. It's always been my practice. If you look at a balance sheet from year to year, that's your real key there, is to how are we doing here. We accumulated more debt, but we're paying our bills on a monthly basis. Someday along the way, Peter's got to pay Paul. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So now when I'm looking at the structure of the bonds that are now coming due, the tax revenue and as well as the general obligation bonds in there, we're going to retire 1 or 2 in this decade. Then there's a whole bunch of them in the 20s. Then in the 30s, 2035 is where our bonds go out to. Now, if we acquire additional debt, we're going to acquire even more debt that we're going to have to pay even longer period of time. Right now, the city is paying $10 million a year in debt service. Now, so what happens is we're paying this money. When you compound interest, it's coming to you, it's great. But it's like when you buy a house and you have, let's say, a $100,000 mortgage on it, and then you look at the total on the payout of that, even at a modest, say, 4 or 5%, you're almost doubling the cost of it over a period of time. So that's what's happening to us now, is that we're eating up part of our capital that we could be using, that $10 million, had we not acquired so much debt sooner. And you'll hear people say, well, this is what the people want now. The people don't want additional debt. Just looking around our country, we have a debt problem here. Now, how do you do that? If you're not going to increase your revenue, that means you have to cut spending. Now, I don't know where that's going to come from, but we've got to work real hard on that. And I would like to say one thing, too. If you're penny wise and dollar foolish here, I went to the police headquarters the other day. The lawn outside there is absolutely yellow and brown out there. And there's a great big weed growing right up there on the entranceway to go in to talk to Chief Cook at the Police Administration Building. Look at it when you drive by sometimes, 605 East Evergreen, and see what has happened here. For a small amount, we could at least have green grass in front of the police chief's office. But yet we can afford an $18 million new city hall. Somehow it doesn't register with me, because appearance shows that you take pride in your city, and if we can't afford that much money, I'd be more than happy to donate to a fund to make green grass in front of the police chief's office. Well, thank you very much. I welcome the opportunity to be here, and I hope that I've come close to answering the questions. Some of them I may have pushed aside, but trying to make a point on that. The one thing that I think that we're going to have to realize is that this year, as we vote, is again next year, if we have a bunch of people who are in academia and people who have never actually had to sign payroll checks, it's very difficult for them to imagine what it's like to have the pressure of business being on you and being responsible for the livelihood of those people who work for you. At one time, I was a partner in a electronics firm, and we had 60 people. And when it came time for payroll, and you didn't have quite enough money there, it's kind of like Lee Trevino once said. He says, you talk about pressure in the U.S. Open. He said, how about if you're in a golf Nassau, you're playing a Nassau, a little gambling game, and the stakes are $10 and you have $5 in your pocket. That is pressure. Okay, it's the same thing with being in business. You have to plan your cash flow. You have to plan inventory. You have to have trained people. You may have to have some layoffs. All of these things are very basic and fundamental to a business people that someone who has never been in that particular environment does not understand. They can go talk to business people and they can say, yes, I understand, but they've never lived it. You've got to live that in order to understand what the pressures are of doing business. And that is one of the things that I'm going to bring to the table, is because I do that. When you look at the composition of City Hall now, you don't have all that much expertise in the private sector, which is what I will bring to the table. I've also had leadership training in the military, and I think that I'm pretty much of a complete package to help this city grow. I've got some ideas about that. Another thing I'd like to make is a point here. There are jobs available. There are a lot of jobs available. Unfortunately, they're not trained properly. You have people who work, like at US Digital here, who have to handle fine precision tooling, and a lot of people are not trained to do that. What we have to do is to match up our requirements in the future with the young people coming up and people who are being retrained in order to fill those type of jobs. We have delegations coming here from Japan and China who are coming in here. They're looking for a place where they can get affordable, available energy on a 24/365 basis. They want to find a place where they can have cheap energy. The state of Washington really doesn't have a good plan to cut energy costs in order to attract foreign capital. Also land. Chinese are looking for land. We had a delegation here recently. So we have to think of Washington as being right on the Pacific Rim here. We're ideally located. The Port of Vancouver is critical for the growth of this area here. And we have to understand that between the Port of Vancouver and Washington State University, Clark College, the Skill Center, all of these things fit together as a package so that we can improve the climate here, to improve this revenue that I talked about before, so that we don't have to cut core services any further. Okay. So I've got a vision, and I hope that I get the opportunity to help implement it.